Hello and welcome to Alternative to Meds podcast. My name is Debbie Nelson, and today I'm excited and pleased to introduce Dr. Richard Jacoby. Dr. Jacoby has made it his lifelong mission, has written a couple best-selling books. One is called The Sugar Crush. He has a brand new one that's come out that's called Unglued. Welcome, Dr. Jacoby. How are you?
I'm great. And how are you? It's nice to be here.
So, Dr. Jacoby, when I first met you and learned of the work that you were doing, I was really excited to put you on our podcast because I think before when I had explained to you, this is an activation. I always say the people that join this, like it, share it, make sure that you put it out there because our goal is to help us link arms with other practitioners like yourself that are providing services that are what people are looking for. Basically, they're looking for solutions. So, Dr. Jacoby, when you started down this path, you got to kind of give me an insight. What inspired you to start getting into stem cell and diet and all of these things as a podiatrist?
Well, that's really an interesting question because I ask myself that as well. And it really goes back 50 years when I was in medical school. And I did a work study program that was popular back in those days to get some extra money, and worked in a laboratory with Dr. Michael Sheff, who is a world famous DNA specialist from Watson and Crick. He worked in that laboratory in London. I was in Philadelphia, and we worked on PKU, which is the brain problem with newborns. And I learned his techniques, and that got the bug started. And then I finished my residency in Philadelphia, came out to Phoenix, and I had the good fortune of starting the Scottsdale Healthcare, it was called at that time, Honor Health Wound Care Center in Scottsdale. And that was about 35 years ago. And then I ran into Dr. Lee Dellon out of Johns Hopkins, has a novel procedure for decompressing nerves of the lower extremity for diabetic neuropathy. And he taught me down at Johns Hopkins. I did thousands of those procedures, and I made the mistake of saying to him, Dr. Dellon, there's more to your theory. He said, well, you figure it out. I said, okay, I'm going to try to do that. And I was lucky. I read an article by Dr. John Cook out of Stanford about 15 years ago. It was called the Uber Marker. He's a cardiologist by training, PhD in vascular biology, studies one molecule, asymmetric dimethylarginine. Big word, but 50 years ago, I was working with Dr. Sheff, and that's what we were looking at, trying to unsolve the mystery of PKU, which we did not do, but it has been solved. And asymmetric dimethylarginine, I'll explain that word, it's an interesting word, it's part of that equation. 50 years later, and I was involved in both sides of that world. So that's how I came to understand that word. So I'll break the word down for you because I like biochemistry and I like to break it down simple. So asymmetric means a molecule that's not on the same size of molecules. So we have L-arginine, semi-essential amino acid. We have a methyl group, should be on both sides. When it's not good, they are on the same side, asymmetric dimethyl, meaning two methyl groups on that amino acid arginine. Profound problems when those levels are elevated. And that's the work I did with Dr. Cook at Stanford, looking at diabetic neuropathy patients to see if they had elevated levels, and they do. But the amazing thing, they had elevated levels, not just the peripheral nerves, but all nerves, which when you think about it, of course that's true.
Right.
These diseases are not separate and distinct. They're systemic. They're insidious, and they are all over the body. It's biochemistry, and sugar causes that problem. So then I did a deep dive into why and where the whole mechanism started with. And it really is, I mean, I hate to say it goes back to our government. They had the food pyramid, eat this junk because it's politically constructed food pyramid. Now it's a plate. So, it's just a Ponzi, or it's just a game. So you pay to play to get onto that. And big pharma, carbohydrates, are dominating this, and they are destroying our nervous system, including the brain. And that's the problem. And our institutions of learning have also been corrupted because they're not stopping it. They're looking for a drug to solve the problem. That's noble to do that, but we got to change the diet. Now, I morphed that into, and this is where I came to the book Unglued. And I'll tell the audience how I came to that word, because this is kind of embarrassing. I was asked over in Hollywood last year, because they want to do a Netflix on this. And they said, what's the word, what's the problem? I said, sugar. He said, well, which sugar? And I said, glucose and fructose and all the rest of them. And he says, let's talk about glucose. What's that word mean? And I go into the biochemistry, asymmetric dimethylhydrogen. No. What does the word mean? And you know what? I didn't know. I had to look it up. Glucose means, it's a Greek word, means to adhere, to stick together. It's glue, just as the word says. It's glucose. And then I realized my patients want to know how to get unglued. And that's what led into the stem cell. And stem cells unglue every one of these inflammatory manifestations that sugar causes. Every one of them. I don't care if it's Alzheimer's, autism, diabetic neuropathy, carpal tunnel, you name it, they will fix it. Well, why aren't we having that discussion like we're having this now, as we will have in Unglued? Because I hate to say this, but the government knows this works. Big Pharma knows this works. And that's why they're trying to make it into a drug. And they actually have made it into a drug. That's why you have to go out of the country. So I've talked to the best of the best in the world. For instance, Don Johansson, he is the discoverer of Lucy. Now, it takes a little deep dive on this. He discovered Lucy, which is quote unquote our first primate 3.2 million years ago. And she is evolved, and that's who we are today. And that's through diet and mutations of genes. And we'll get into the epigenetics, that's another subject. But if amniotic fluid is a drug, are pregnant women drug dealers or just mules? Women have been carrying the perinatal tissues, as what we call them, the umbilical cord, the Wharton's jelly, which is the supportive tissue of the umbilical cord, the amniotic fluid, which is the baby is surrounded in. These are all perinatal tissues. Then they have stem cell-like qualities and growth factors, and I get into that in the book. That's a whole big subject to discuss. But I went down to Panama to see Dr. Reardon's clinic. And that's world famous. And he actually was from Tempe, Arizona. And he's a PhD. His father is a very famous MD. And he explored this whole perinatal tissue subject going back to 2000 when President Bush said no stem cell research on embryonic stem cells. That's the fetus taking the blastula and extracting those cells, and that's embryonic stem cells. And I think it was probably a good decision, but that forced scientists to look at the non-embryonic adult stem cells, and Dr. Reardon's the leader in that. So I visited him several times and try to get understanding exactly what he was thinking. And I went to Panama to see his patients, spend a couple of weeks there. And we'll talk about the brain problem. So in the brain problem, we have autism, okay? So these kids are amazingly all look similar, whether they're from India, Africa, US, Canada, doesn't matter, different ethnicities, they all have the same faces. And I explain that in the book. And what I'm saying there is there's a biochemical epigenetic problem during gestation on day 22 to day 24 after conception. And the gene that's supposed to be put down at the what's called the olive in the back of the brain here on day 22 to day 24, and it does not manifest. And I don't know if you can see this, but let's just assume this pin is a hypoglossal nerve that's located here, the nucleus. And when that is narrowed on those days, by 1.1 millimeter, I say that's compression, the same as compression on the carpal tunnel of the wrist, which is this function. And the function of the hypoglossal nerve as it innervates the tongue, which is a muscle, and this is a muscle, this is a nerve, sugar, nerve, muscle, function. They're the same thing, but we call them different diseases caused by sugar. It's that simple. Now, when I was in Panama, these kids, they're all over the place. And I recognized one kid, I was watching him in the cafeteria, and he was eating, I hate to say it this way, he was eating like a dog, as they all work. They were eating massive amounts of carbohydrates. They look left to right, try to guard their food like dogs do. And I saw this woman and I said, is this your first time to the clinic? And she said, no, it's my third time. Now, understand, this is about $20,000 a treatment. And I said, does it work? She said, of course it does. Really? Why did you come back? Well, it wears off. I said, well, I noticed you're feeding your son lots of oatmeal and pancakes and juices. That's all sugar. I say that's the problem. And I said, well, tell me what happens when you get the umbilical tissue. So, well, we get the IV, and then eventually, after a couple of days, he's able to speak. And I don't know why I said this. I said, what did he say? And he said, I want a donut. And I was, well, there's your answer. And she got really miffed at me for telling her that. I have plenty of money. I'll come here every year and get the treatment. And I want to give him whatever he wants. Well, that doesn't make sense to me. You're giving him sugar, which causes the inflammation, which causes the nerve dysfunction. It's that simple. Now, stem cells do work, but the average person can't do that. So I'm trying to get a message out, it's sugar. And even stem cells, which I love, they have no side effects. They're effective, they're safe, but they're being withheld from the American public.
Have you had much experience in the application of using it for neurological? I know, like you started with all these other conditions that you work on. And I find it just interesting just because we have huge, schizophrenia, bipolar 1, depressive disorders, MS, Parkinson's, ADHD. We have a host of things. So do you still confirm that the root of a lot of that is the inflammation that's from our diets, and then it does further problems?
Oh, absolutely. So the diet, rich in carbohydrates, which is poorly grown, and it's vitamin deficient, and all the B vitamins, that's a big part of my equation. That's what the asymmetric dimethylarginine is about, the cofactor, tetrahydrobiopterin, blah, 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 blah. I mean, that's hard to explain in a video. You would have to see them demonstrated, but the B vitamins are extremely important for nerve function, especially for cognitive problems.
Right.
And if you don't have those elements in your diet, then you're going to have symptoms. And what you named, all those different, they're symptoms, they're not diseases.
Right.
See, and that's where I think all of medicine gets this confused. And I talk about that in Unglued because my book chapter opens with a autopsy. My autopsy that I first attended, I like to say 100 years ago, in Philadelphia, which is a cold, oh, it's just horrible. And this autopsy was in a Gothic building in the 1800s. Oh my God, down the steps and incandescent lights. And I arrived at this autopsy and I was late for the autopsy, and all the medical students are standing around this slab. And I walk up and the woman was already opened in the Y-shaped incision. They were opening her brain at the time. This is my first autopsy. And I look, and the instructor, it was a woman pathologist, which is interesting in those days. And she pointed at me, she said, what do you see? I said, what do I see? I'm thinking to myself, this is a horror show. And I couldn't really verbalize anything. She said, no, what do you see? And I still couldn't. She said, well, describe this spot. She pointed to this spot. And she, well, what's the color? I said, well, it's gray. And she, well, what else do you see? And I said, looks like a gray blob to me on top of the kidney. She said, excellent. You just described a pheochromocytoma, cause of death of this woman. I said, really? To myself, what the hell did I just say? I said gray blob. She said pheochromocytoma. She told me in Latin, pheo means gray, chromo, color, cytoma is tumor. Well, that's not a diagnosis. That's an observation using another language, just as you did with all the neurological ones. And that was 50 years ago. And I was thinking, well, wait a minute, this is ridiculous. But I had to pass the test, so I had to regurgitate all the nonsense, which I did. And I'm still at it. And it is nonsense. And stem cells, I use a phrase, this doesn't get me any friends, but stem cells don't give a rat's ass what you call your itis.
I say the same thing though, Dr. Jacoby, because I think that we all focus on, people almost love the diagnosis, right? It's kind of like we hang on to it and we're like, this is what I'm dealing with.
Yeah.
And instead, we're not looking at medicine in the sense of, those are my symptoms. What's driving the symptoms that are creating my discomfort?
Right.
And I think if we all looked at it, a systemic aspect, and that's what this functional medicine and integrative approach is. We're not saying medicine's bad. What we're saying is, it is time for us to look at root issues driving the problem. So like alternative to meds, he said long before other people were even jumping on this, and probably you as well, hey, nobody's paying attention to what the diet is doing to your brain.
Right. Well,
and people still want to think this is separate. Like, we can eat whatever we want. It doesn't affect this. Like, I'm going to go get cookie crumble and a Coke this afternoon. And then I'm going to go off the rails with anxiety issues like that. But I'm never going to attribute it that I downed a 64-ounce Coke and ate 3 cookie crumbles for lunch.
I did like those cookie crumbles at one time.
Well, that's the important thing, though. That is one thing, and I'll say to people, I like a cookie crumble too. Now, the difference is, if I'm acute and I'm suffering and I am sick, that cookie crumble better get put down, because I'm in a really, really serious state. And I think most people don't recognize that their mental health is directly related to, I'm in a serious place. I need to reel in my diet.
Absolutely. And that's rule number one.
Yeah.
And also with the functional medicine, which I do follow, and I guess I would be called a functional medicine, but they make it too complicated as well. It's not that complicated. You just gave the answer. And so they like to get into the biochemistry, which I like, but it's not necessary, like NAD and acetylcholine, et cetera, blah, 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 blah. Well, do you really? That's back to the sentence. Stem cells don't give a rat's ass what you call your itis. Because I'll give you a little example of what I have in the book on that sentence. So there's a really good stem cell advocate. His name is Ian White. He's a PhD out of London. He's in Florida at the present time. And he is expert in exosomes. And exosomes are the nanoparticles of stem cells. They're little, what we call vesicles that carry information and cell-to-cell communication. And his best experiment I liked was, he took a rat, ironically, a rat, and I had this sentence before I heard him. He took a rat and injected exosomes in the rat's tail vein, and then took the rat and caused a trauma on the tibia. And at the same time, he tagged the stem cells, the exosomes, and did a film in color. So if you can picture this, as he injected the exosomes, they were swarming around like bees. And you could see them, they were looking for direction. And when he caused trauma to the tibia, Those bees went directly to the trauma.
Wow.
And why did they do that? Because it's a signaling molecule, to get technical, in the paracrine system, if you like to know that sort of things. But I'm saying stem cells don't give a rat's ass what you call uritis, because they're going to respond wherever the area of inflammation is causing that symptom that sugar is causing. And why do we have all these different itises per se? I say that's because of epigenetics. I'll give you a second point. Joanne Kurtzberg, famous and very good investigator at Duke University. I see her at one of the Prairie stem cell meetings in Utah several years ago, and she gave a great lecture on autism and muscular dystrophy. Would our audience agree they're two different diseases?
Mhm.
Yeah, they don't sound like they're close, do they? Okay, she shows gene arrays, which is the epigenetic printout before and after. She injects, now she was using hematopoietic stem cells, which are the blood component of the umbilical cord. And she showed films of these kids, one with autism, one with muscular dystrophy. She gives them the injection. These kids, the kid who couldn't speak is speaking. The kid who couldn't walk, muscular dystrophy, he is now walking. I said, Dr. Kurtzberg, you've got a couple things going on here. And of course, I'm a little brash at that. And I said, number one, these are not genetic diseases. And she looks at me, she said, what do you mean? I said, well, they're two different diseases. You gave them the same dose of the same quote unquote medication, and they both got better. How's that possible? Well, she kind of looked puzzled at me, number one. And number two, I said they were never genetic diseases to start with. They're epigenetic, which was another puzzling look. And what I meant by that, you reversed the gene array. It's not fixed. It's not immutable. In other words, if you have a genetic disease, most people think, well, that's it. You don't change it. Well, you can change it because it never was that. It's a manifestation of sugar early on, even gestational, like I described with autism, which changes your genes. Give them the juice, like I like to say, and you reverse that process. Big Pharma doesn't like that. They don't like that.
So what I'm hearing from you when you talk about your books and such is that you started out like in a traditional sense of like, all right, I'm a podiatrist. Then you started realizing it really doesn't matter what it is that I'm applying this to. It will go like a bee and a beehive and start healing that aspect of what a person needs to be regenerated or to be healed. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
So that's
Now,
how it's
provided,
evolution. So that's why when someone says, well, how did a podiatrist? Because as a podiatrist, you're like, no, it doesn't really matter what field. If we tag it right, if I've got dementia going on, if I'm schizophrenic. Now, in this country, we still can't use it applicably for brain related things. So people are
yeah,
forced to go out of the country, correct?
yeah, you can't use it because it works. So that's where we get into 361 and 351. That's the legal definition of the FDA. So 351 means a new drug application. That costs $1 billion, takes 10 years if you wanted to answer your question,
Wow.
like schizophrenia or whatever. And each one of those has to have a different application. Now, who do you think in the room could spend that kind of money and do that kind of research?
Right.
Oh, hi, Mr. Pfizer and Mr. Johnson and Johnson. Yes, Big Pharma. Now, I'm not against Big Pharma solving this. I am against intrusion by government to slow walk the cure. Well, let's go to 2003, Senate hearing, John McCain, Arizona guy, right?
Right.
Yeah, he conducted hearings in 2003 US Senate. You can look it up, your audience can look it up. And Joanne Kurtzberg was there. She explained all that to the committee, and there were 17 different senators there. They used the word miracle. Miracle.
Wow.
If this is anything, that was 20 years ago. 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Why is it not mainstream? This is outrageous. Absolutely outrageous.
I think it's not only outrageous, we get to a point where it's sad. Just because we do have such a large amount of so many people that are needlessly, but like what you said, as a country, I love Dr. Kendra Campbell. She's on TikTok, and we did an interview with her. Well, she recently had a video that was going over Easter, and she showed as she walked through the aisles that someone was saying, we literally have poisoning that's happening, and then we don't understand why our children are having learning difficulties and problems. And yet every holiday, whether it's Valentine's or Halloween, or there's aisles that are just packed with literal neurotoxins that we're feeding ourselves as a reward. Yeah.
I was in the, I shouldn't use names, grocery store, and I was just idling through the aisles, and I was thinking, I wonder if I could find anything in this place that didn't have sugar in it. It was damn near impossible. Even the meat, which is corn fed,
Yep.
very small amount are grass fed. So they're all inflammatory omega-6, and you know that whole story. And I'm wandering around, and I went to the back of the store, and there's the pharmacy. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, I've looked at the baskets of these people who are extremely overweight with their baskets full of junk food, going to the pharmacy to get the medicine to counteract what they're buying in the store.
Yeah.
How bizarre is that? Oh, we can't figure this problem out. This is too complex. No, it's not. There's the answer right there.
Yeah, there is. And then there's also, I'll do the reverse where I'll say, all right, fine. We want to play this same game, but let's do it on the positive side. I'll throw it out there, Costco. Go to Costco and look at the people that are running around with the organic in their cart. Or go to Whole Foods or natural grocers and see whether or not they look in that regard. They're not the ones in the cart that's elect.
Yeah.
They're not, but you will see the common, like there is a part of me, I've had a significant weight problem in my life. So I know both sides of the fence. So when people talk that, like I used to say, I mean, I love sugar, love it. Now, what I started realizing was how much that really, I couldn't logically, you can't learn this. It's just like what you said. You can't unlearn what you learn. And when you learn it and you start understanding the neurochemistry behind what we're eating, how we're cleaning our homes, what we're exposing ourselves to, once you do, you start becoming hyper vigilant. Like, why would I want to use a lipstick that has lead, for instance?
Yeah, right.
Why am I going to want to eat something because the FDA says, well, it's not a toxic level? I'm sorry, I'm 56 years old. How much lead have I eaten over the years putting something on my lips? There is no acceptable level of a carcinogen. And that's the part that as a society, we have to start demanding with our dollars reform.
Absolutely. Well, it starts with education. It starts with education the way we're doing it right now with your podcast. Because the traditional media, and there's a big brouhaha with the Fox News of yesterday with Tucker Carlson on the right and then Lemon on the left. We don't have two different medias. We have one media, one agenda. And if it wasn't for podcasts like this, we would be done as a society. Absolutely done. So we're going to get this message out, and that's what you're doing. And this
yeah, we're going to get this out. If we have anything to do with this, that's why when I meet doctors like this, people, I am sincerely like starstruck. It sounds kind of crazy, Dr. Jacoby, but seriously, you have to be kind of geeky like I am. That when you meet someone, I get really excited because not unlike you, I haven't been a doctor, but I've dealt with the other side of having to help people find help. And there's nothing more debilitating than to see people that sincerely want to get well. And it's linking hands with people like yourself. What aspects could you do in the United States?
Well, as I said, they labeled amniotic tissue as a drug, and you can get those, but the laboratories that manufacture it are being closed down. So theoretically, I could use it, and there's a very small supply, and that'll be done in about another 3 months. You can use umbilical tissue. That is still legal. Now, because this is where the terminology comes in, because they have their rules, the FDA. It has to be homologous use, meaning that the umbilical cord, Wharton's jelly, the supportive tissue, can be used in the body if it's similar application. Let's say where my field around nerves, does that support nerves? Yes. So I can do that. But I'm sure over time they're going to say, well, we're going to rethink that one, and they'll probably eliminate that.
Right.
You can use it IV. I don't use IV therapy in my practice because I think it would draw too much attention. And I don't treat autism and neurologic diseases, but there are doctors who do in the United States. But it's just a little bit dicey, I think, to make kind of claims like autism and Alzheimer's and all the rest of them, because then you're saying that you have scientific proof that this works. No, you don't. We
Right.
have lots and lots of articles, but we don't have a double-blind study on these diseases. That'll take 10 years. And let's take the autism again. I'm going to give you a statistic. When I first started to look at this, autism, there were 16 births in the year 2000 per 10,000 births of autism. Today it's about 1 in 38. That's
Wow.
well, I know that's a national disgrace. And I attribute it to, when you look at the curve, and I don't have a slide in front of me to show you this, but think of this. In 1974, high fructose corn syrup was introduced into the American diet and to the genome. So this just is some easy numbers. So 74, 20 years later, we have 94. Women are starting to have families, and that curve starts to go like that. So in year 2000, we had 16 births per 10,000. Now we have 1 in 38. And with that trajectory, that means in a couple more years, we'll be down almost to 1 in 2 births. That's not a national disgrace. That's a national emergency. We talk about phony COVID crap, and I'm using that term, and getting vaccines that don't work, and natural immunity does, and the CDC is admitting it, when the real issue is autism, because our population will be decimated, absolutely decimated. Now, I also noticed that a lot of these scientists, Stephanie Seneff being one of them, out of MIT, and she wrote a great book for your audience, Toxic Legacy on Glyphosate. There's Nina Teichholz, who wrote The Big Fat Surprise, and she's the one that blew up this whole fat hypothesis that is bad and reversed it into it is good. And then we have a host of other women, including Kurtzberg. But I noticed that all the meetings I go to, they're young scientists, and they're predominantly women now. It's amazing. So women need to take over this charge of what Lucy started, if we want to go with the initial primate. You produce that material that's going to save civilization. Absolutely. So we're out there with, Walk for the Cure and wearing pink ribbons. And I hate to put this down, but that's a bunch of nonsense as well. They're looking for the cure, which means a drug. I'm looking for the cure, which means prevention, and that's education. This stuff is poison, absolute poison. And it's in our food supply. And if we don't do something about it now, we're done as a society. This is way more than diabetic neuropathy. Even though, by the way, worldwide, we have 1.5 million amputations every year on planet Earth. 1.5 million. And Dr. Dellon's work has never been published at what we call level 1, because they're forcing him to do a sham surgery trial. This is in the book, but basically do a surgery on the opposite leg and do the real surgery, then look at the results. And that study was done 10 years ago. Lancet, JAMA won't publish it. You know why? Because some of the placebo effect on the opposite leg were getting better as well, which means his theory is phenomenal, because it goes against big pharma, Lyric. That's why, because that's the big drug in diabetic neuropathy, my field. The surgery works, stem cells work. Well, where's your evidence? Well, you block it. That's why. Go to the universities and try to get it through. I've done that. And that's a whole other story.
Well,
they're dominated by that.
I think that there's, as a whole, an evolution of people that are exiting mainstream medical and no longer putting up with that mentality that this is what's being served to me. Because I think that there's a whole lot of people that are realizing, like, I'm not getting better, I just keep getting worse.
Absolutely. Look at the breast cancer. Look at the breast cancer.
Yep.
You have BRCA gene. No, you don't. I mean, I shouldn't say no, you don't have the gene, but 50% of people have that gene don't get breast cancer. So what is the mechanism? If you carry that gene, it's sugar. It activates that gene, you'll have the problem. If you don't eat that crap, you won't.
Well, one thing I think is interesting too is right when the pharmaceutical companies came out full bore and were able to advertise back in the 80s, we also ironically had a huge, those of you that were back then, I'm 56, the fat-free craze, right? Which was really just a high sugar, high carbohydrate. We eliminated fats from our diet and everything was fat-free. That was the health craze then. We're eating fat-free. And you still will hear people that will still employ that mentality. I recently had someone that called and he was taking on a ketogenic sort of diet. He was having mental health problems and his doctor really was upset with him. He was young, that he was going to have cardiac arrest. He kept telling him, you're going to have this problem and this problem if you keep eating this. And ironically, here this young man was really just trying to lose weight from the medications the doctor had given him. So he was gaining weight from the neurological prescription that the doctor had given him, trying to get off of the medication, and then doing a ketogenic diet, and then being told, you can't do that, that's dangerous.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, the disease epilepsy, which is just a symptom of too much carbohydrates, epigenetic, if you carry those alleles, as they call them, and those sets of genes, like let's, for instance, in epigenetics, let's say you have one gene allele that would express for epilepsy, and I have 10. Well, you take a teaspoon of sugar, nothing happens. I take a teaspoon of sugar and I get an epilepsy event. They knew and know this, that if you change your diet to a fat-based, epilepsy goes away. Oh, that's a different disease. No, it's not. I mean, glioblastoma, that's sugar. That's cancer. The breast cancer. In my book, Sugar Crush, I even talk about Otto Warburg, who got the Nobel Prize in 1934 for his experiments on fructose fermentation that allowed sugar to feed these cancer cells. You take the sugar away, the cancer cells die. If you don't take it away, you die. What's so complicated about that? Well, I like those crumbles. You know what I mean? I mean,
I like C's chocolate.
Well, yeah, we did. And I'm old enough to went through all these phases. But I also noticed, like, let's take Nina Teichholz, and she's a courageous person, very courageous. She's a journalist, not medically trained, and she figured this all out just by reading the literature. She wrote that book, Big Fat Surprise, and everybody should read that book. And she put me on the Nutrition Coalition, which is a independent group that advises the government food input. Where do you hear this one? This just happened out of Tufts University, famous nutritionists. So they did a study, and your audience is going to be shocked when they hear this. They did a study and ranked foods, and I don't remember exactly, say there's 50 foods. Number one food for health for children and adults. What do you think that was?
Well, you mean what we would say, or what the FDA says? I would say
This is a private institution
probably
funded.
processed cereal.
Yes.
Yep.
Fruit Loops.
Yep.
Loops.
It's insane. I heard the same study. I was like, I went ballistic just like you. I'm like, what the hell is this?
Exactly. So you realize what the fraud is about.
Yeah.
And eggs were on the bottom.
Yep.
So those investigators, scientists, the America needs a conversation on this subject. Now, let's look at it from a globally standpoint. I don't remember when we lost our sovereign right to our own health. Do you remember when that happened? Isn't that the pursuit of health and happiness? Isn't that an inalienable right?
Right.
When did that get taken away? That's the conversation. When did that get taken away? When did the FDA become Lord over our sovereign right to be healthy?
I have talked to thousands of people, and it doesn't take much that after you start seeing it, like you said, you cannot turn your back on what you know. If you think that this is made up, go on any social media platform and type in a drug and see how many people that there's entire Facebook forums of people trying to support one another, trying to get off of a drug.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I don't know too many people, like we're not running around saying, I'm really trying to get off of broccoli. It's really been causing me a great deal of problems in my life, broccoli and fish. And, I've had a horrible time eating that salmon. But we have tremendous amount of an epidemic. And, that's why I think everyone should read the book by Robert Whitaker, Epidemic, Anatomy of an Epidemic. Because we are in a place of our health that is a crisis level. Now, after COVID in particular, we had Zoom conference calls that were happening with our providers, nurse practitioners that were prescribing people. We literally have stories of people that crushed up amphetamines and put it in their toddlers' sippy cups because that's what the doctor was telling them that they needed, where that's going to go, we all know it's not going to go well.
No.
It's not. And but something as simplistic as my question is the same thing. Well, what was the child having in the sippy cup in the first place?
Correct.
Right.
Exactly.
What were they drinking in the first place? And as a society, that maybe it seems almost too like what you said. When you're talking about your education and you're a doctor, so of course we're like, oh, it's a doctor. It seems almost too simplistic. But when doctors actually come out and say, sorry, it really is this simplistic, you're ruining your health based on your diet. Now, stem cells, another whole thing, just because what you've got into to regenerate the damage that's been done is pretty exciting. I mean, I get excited about that because I do know people that would gladly travel if they thought that this was going to help them. So there's cases that you can do here. There's cases that you can go out of the country to do. You're
Correct.
willing to do either. You've helped people with all different, what is the gamut of people that you help with stem cell? Like, what is the field that you're working, the parameter?
Well, my field is peripheral neuropathy, but it's interesting, and I'll give you an example. A patient I had seen about 5 years ago. Now, this word stem cell has become generic. Now, I was using amniotic tissue with her, which is technically not a stem cell, they're growth factors. But anyway, she she called the clinic, and they asked me, do you remember this patient? I said, yeah, I do. Well, she needs her records to go up to Mayo Clinic. And I said, why is she going up there? Well, the stem cells, quote unquote, didn't work. So I said, well, that was 5 years ago. Let me talk to her. So I talked to her. Well, did you change her diet? And her husband was in the background. This is on the phone. She said, no, equivocally, she didn't change her diet. I said, well, you mean it didn't work for your peripheral neuropathy? Well, it worked in the beginning. And now this is 5 years later. Now I have the symptoms back. Well, I said, it proves this point. It did work, just like that autistic kid in Panama. You didn't change your diet because you're addicted. So she comes in and we redid it. And I said to her, tell me your history because it's been 5 years. Well, you know, blah, blah, blah. And she had actually 12 physicians following her case, 12, because she had every itis you can think of. In particular, she had Sjogren's syndrome. She also had autoimmune hepatitis. And she tells me this story, which is really kind of interesting. She said, I went to my hepatologist, liver doctor, and told her I was going to do stem cells, which was amnio. And the doctor freaked out and said, don't do it. There's not enough research. She said, well, I already did it. Well, I got to check all your lab work. She checks all her lab work and it comes back. She said, I'm taking you off all the medicines because your hepatitis is resolved, but I need to see you regularly. Well, that was the side effect of my injection. I didn't inject her to get rid of her hepatitis, but that was the side effect. Because the stem cells, the growth factors go to wherever it's needed. I can't control them to correct some other itis. They're going to go where the major itis is. That's all. And if that's the side effect, so be it.
Yeah, it sounds like a pretty good side effect, honestly.
Yeah.
So how many treatments do people typically do?
One.
You're kidding.
That's it. I mean, autism may take a little bit more because they're cranial nerves, they have more protection, but peripheral neuropathy on most times one, but they have to change their diet. They need to do vitamins. There's other things to do, like red light therapy, which is good, by the way. Saunas are good. All these things that detox your system, that needs to be done. Otherwise, I like to say it to a patient like this. There's a fire at your house. Firemen arrive, start spraying foam on the fire.
Right.
You're in the back room throwing gasoline on the fire, and you say that firemen's foam don't work. Of course it does. But you've got to stop to put the gasoline on the fire. Inflammation, that's what the word inflammation means. It's on fire, your tissues, they're inflamed. White cells come to the party and they try to put the fire out. That's our natural immunity. We call that autoimmune disease. That's another subject in my book. There is no such thing as autoimmune disease. That's absurd. Like your body's going to attack itself. The body's white cells are attacking the invader, which they're supposed to do, and that invader is sugar. So when epigenetic,
really hurting my feelings with the sugar thing.
So I mean,
actually, you're not. Like I said, I know this. I know it. And like I tell people all the time, how badly do you want to get well?
That's a good phrase. Exactly.
I mean, one of my key things that I tell people all the time is we're not here to master our problems. We're here to master our solution.
Yeah.
So keep talking about your problem. Do you want to master the solution or not? And some people don't. Honestly, there's a lot of people that just want the medication and go home.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Now,
Totally.
the science in me, or put it this way, the person in me that sees the results that I've seen time and time again with myself and other people included, it's undeniable. And it's amazing to me that something that I once touted as something that was a trial, truthfully, who doesn't want to feel good? Like I'm addicted to eating to feel good. Doesn't mean I don't want pizza, but I want to feel good at this point in my life.
Exactly. And that's why it's called comfort food.
Right,
It makes you feel good. It's a
right,
drug.
right,
But, and I have nothing wrong with that. You have pizza, you have all kinds of carbohydrate things. As long as you know that is poison,
right.
it give you comfort, and and human body and human genome can accept a certain amount of carbohydrates. You don't have to go totally carnivore, but I'll tell you what I did. I did go carnivore for a month. I lost so much weight, I had to get some carbs back. Carnivore diet just evaporates your sensitivity to carbohydrates, and your appetite just goes down because you don't need food, and you can go days without eating anything and feel great because you're using ketones for energy, which the brain needs, not sugar. I just throw a fact out here. This is surprising. The human body only needs at any one time 1 teaspoon of glucose. That's 4 grams. Anything above that kicks on the insulin switch to get rid of that sugar. 1 teaspoon. Most Americans are eating 40 to 50 teaspoons of sugar a day. Of course they're sick.
Right.
Of course they have every itis you can think of, and the damage is done. So I don't want to get into a lecture here. I've probably spoken too much already on this subject.
No, that's cool. That's honestly, that's one of the things that, um, I mean, alternative to med center, honestly, that's probably the easiest thing. And people will think it's going to be the most difficult. Sustainability, when it comes to reforming the diet, it's amazing how many people will reform that and don't realize how easy that actually is and how great they feel. It's they go back into that same mode that they do when they leave an environment. And it is learning basic things, but truthfully, healthy eating is simple eating. It isn't big complicated things. I mean, it's a piece of fish, it's steamed vegetables, it's not complicated.
No, it's not complicated. And that's why you have the French paradox, because they have the paradox of eating a lot of fat and quote unquote rich food. They don't have heart disease. So we call it paradox. No, that's the normal diet that Lucy ate. Now, she didn't prepare the food as well as the French did, but it's basically what you just said. It's meat, cream sauces, what we would say, and fat and duck fat, lots of butter. Oh my God, that causes cardiovascular disease. No, it doesn't. Sugar does. That's another element in my book, Sugar Crush. How did I come upon that? Because I asked Dr. Cook, world's leading cardiologist at Stanford, ran the Reagan Clinic there, the metabolic clinic. That's where they came up with Syndrome X, insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome. That's the clinic he ran. I asked him the question, Dr. Cook, I'm confused about this cholesterol hypothesis. I really wasn't. I just wanted to be nice. And I don't want to offend him. So I said, hey, Dr. Cook, can you walk me through that? And he said, yeah. He said, well, the endothelium, the lining of the blood vessel, is like Teflon. And that's called the endothelium. It's like smooth as can be. When you eat sugar, it makes it like Velcro.
Wow.
And yeah, and that's what happens. So there's inflammation on the cell wall, and cholesterol, which is manufactured in your liver, is a signaling molecule that comes to put the fire out. So it comes to the area of inflammation and puts down this cholesterol plaque to seal that damage the sugar caused. It's like you look out the window and you hear an accident, or you hear a siren. You look out the window, you see ambulance coming. Ambulance, every day ambulances. Ambulances cause accidents. No, they don't. They respond to accidents. And that's how he explained it to me. It's sugar. It's that simple. And if you look back through the literature, which I did, to a guy by the name of Virchow, in Vienna, 1860s, he opened up an artery, looked at that stuff, and he spoke Greek. And Greek for gunk is athero, and hardened gunk is atherosclerosis. And he even described in his original paper in the 1860s, I think it's caused by inflammation. He didn't know it was sugar, but he knew it was inflammation causing this process. So there's another example. Atherosclerosis, that's not a disease. That's an observation that he made and gave it a Greek word instead of a Latin word for the effect of that process.
Are there any risks that are associated with doing a stem cell on any of these cases? Have you noticed that what are the risks that are associated with it?
Zero.
You're kidding.
No, zero. So, but if you ask the FDA, there were some cases. So there was an FDA lab in California that wasn't inspected well, and there was the E. coli, Escherichia coli, that you could get in spinach or anywhere. And there were some doses that were contaminated, and there were hospitalizations from that. So the FDA said, oh, we got to be careful about stem cells. No, you don't. You need to be careful about E. coli and the manufacturing problem, and that's your agency. That's like saying spinach is dangerous because there's E. coli in there, and we do get those batches. But
Right.
the stem cells themselves, absolutely millions and millions and probably tens of millions now of doses and no adverse event to the stem cell. And that question is asked all the time. I ask that question, why is that? Because the perinatal tissue innately does not have an antigen antibody reaction, because the baby and the baby is a foreign body. So there had to be a mechanism of this tissue to be immunologically privileged cells. And that's the answer to that question. So we got to thank Lucy. Lucy, I kid about that because that's a whole other big subject. But if we did evolve from a primate, and that amniotic fluid, which we were bathed in and grew from, has now been called a drug. Come on. That is just, it's hilarious when you think about it.
Yeah,
We
I never
wouldn't be here
thought
if it
about
wasn't.
it that way, but you're right. When we're talking about, we're actually talking about something that's naturally just being re-implemented.
Right. And our
So-
ancients used it. They took uteruses. Let's say you're out in the battlefield and you had a wound. They took the uterus and put it on the wound because they have all the growth factors and they healed. Now, I will say FDA has approved that, by the way, amniotic membrane for wounds, but they have not approved it for injections. So if it wasn't safe, why are you allowing it in a horrible condition like a diabetic ulcer? It works, but I can't inject it. Need another study. You know, there's something very sinister going on here.
Well, I think we all know, that's the case. We see it time and time again. It doesn't make any sense, you know. Is there any applications that you see now that it's just standard practice? I mean, obviously, as a podiatrist, now it's readily accepted in certain fields of medicine, stem cell is. What would you say? It's kind of like standard and acceptable. What fields?
Well, in a sense, podiatry has more experience with this because of that issue of amniotic membrane. So my experience with stem cells goes back at least 15 years. And prior to that, probably 35 years with PRP. And your audience probably knows that term. PRP is taking your blood, spinning it down and injecting it. Now, it gets complicated with stem cells that they're not stem cells either, but they have a lot of growth factors. And the younger you are, the better it will be to use that. But most people with diabetic ulcers and diabetic neuropathy are not young. They're old because it takes 40 years of this process to break this tissue down. So I don't use PRP, but a lot of people do for younger people with other inflammatory conditions. So I've had a lot of experience with all those substances. And they all have an effect depending on where and when you want to do it. So there's two big divisions in stem cells. And that means autologous, your own cells, versus allogenic, which are somebody else's cells. Okay, that's the division. And then you have embryonic and non-embryonic, another division. So we're using, or I'm using, predominantly non-embryonic adult stem cells of the perinatal tissue. It's very simple. And why don't I use the other big division, which would be the autologous? So in other words, you could take your bone marrow, and I do use bone marrow, drill a hole in the bone, take that bone marrow out, spin it down and re-inject it. Well, that's expensive, it's painful, and not necessary in my opinion, because my patients are older and 90% of the stem cells are gone in potency or numbers by age 50. So why would I drill a hole in your bone?
Right.
Yeah, there's stem cells. And the answer is because that makes it legal. I can use those tissues because they're your tissues. And there was a lawsuit by the FDA against doctors in California, and the FDA lost this one because you can use these your own tissues, but if you're 70 or 60, you really don't want them. You also can take fat derived. Now they have actually more stem cells than fat, and you can spin those down and inject it. So all these things work. That's why you need the conversation with your doctor, who is expert in these things, and see what's best for you. But in summary, I'd say, number one, don't eat the poison. Number two, exercise, move. Number three, there are lots of vitamins and supplements that do help. And then if you're faced with a surgical solution to your itis, and I'll give you an example, as I was about 6 years ago with a herniated disc, playing tennis. And it was a bad one. And I had a bit of a foot drop on my right side. And it is excruciating pain. I did everything, hung upside down, had epidurals, all that stuff. Did help. But finally I said to my neurosurgeon, I said, why don't we use stem cells? His answer was, there's not enough research. I said, I know there's not, but there's no downside to this. So that day I went upstairs, he was downstairs from me, and I went upstairs, I had one of the other doctors in my office. I said, I'm going to mark the spots on my back and leg, and you inject me with this tissue. He did. I was playing tennis in 3 days. I never had the surgery. My advice is, why would you not do this? Let's say it doesn't work. Now you know everything that could be done has been done. And if it helps you, that's the end of the story. You don't need the surgery. I would say 80% of those surgeries, probably in all fields, and I don't know that for a fact, but certainly in my field, are avoidable.